Hi, everyone, and thanks for coming to the city, the most of you. I used to go to this thing to,
What's the appropriate distance?
yeah, like this.
Here? Hello. Is that
Yeah,
good?
this looks comfortable. I'm here moderating a Fireside chat with Jeremy Stoppelman. Usually there's a question about your background, but I'll try to do the TLDR, so we'll jump to the juicy stuff. Jeremy was born in 1977 in Arlington, Virginia, which is far away from here, to an English teacher mother and a lawyer father.
Correct.
Started coding as a child, started investing in stock at the age of 14,
Correct.
and graduated University of Illinois in 1999.
Indeed.
Joined the At Home Network after school.
First cable internet company.
Was a
Yeah.
big hit.
Huge hit. Not really.
4 months after, you understand it's not going to be a huge hit, and joined X.com that became PayPal. Eventually,
I merged with PayPal. It was
Merged with-
Elon Musk's company, and then PayPal was run by the service Confinity, or Confinity was a company, PayPal was a service.
became its VP of engineering
Eventually.
and sold to eBay.
I did not sell myself to eBay, but yes, the company was sold to eBay for, I think, $1.5 billion.
And I think this is the moment where the Yelp story starts.
Almost. So, it was part of the PayPal mafia, but the PayPal mafia wasn't doing a whole lot in 2002 after the eBay sale. And so I started thinking about what I might do. Feeding back. Let's turn this. I think it's going into the microphone.
Wow.
All right. So I thought about what I might do. Now that the company was bought, I'd been through a merger, X.com and PayPal, and that was a little bit dicey. And so I figured the eBay PayPal merger might get a little hot as well. And so I started thinking about alternatives, and there wasn't a whole lot of startup stuff going on in 2002, 2003. So I decided to try my luck with business school, applied to a few schools, and got into Harvard, went there for a year, had a good time. And then in my summer between first and second year, I reconnected originally with Peter Thiel, who was running Clarion Capital, and then he kind of bumped me over to talk to Max Levchin, who was my old boss from PayPal, CTO of PayPal, co-founder of PayPal. And he had started a little incubator. Sort of like a Y Combinator, but much, much smaller and with far more onerous terms. But that's what was going on at the time. And I came in there not necessarily to start a company, but just to help Max out. And I really did have an interest in looking up close and personal at the very beginning of a startup's life. That's something I didn't really have exposure to at X.com/PayPal. Because I joined when it was like 30 people. So it had already gotten venture backing. There was already hundreds of thousands of users using the service. And so I was fascinated with what is it like to go from T0 and get lift off. So I spent the summer hanging out. And Max does pride himself on getting people to drop out. I kind of forgot about that. And within a couple months, he had me just brainstorming, trying to come up with new and exciting consumer internet ideas, which this is summer 2004. There was not a lot of action when it comes to consumer internet. If you talk to VCs at the time, especially when I talked to them, they're like, "Oh, well, I had no gray hair at the time," and they're like, "Well, we would definitely need a gray hair executive to be with you if you started a company, or if we funded you, you would have to step aside." And so it was a very different time. In fact, one of the funnier moments was we did start Yelp, and soon after we tried to raise a little bit of money, and I went over to a VC and pitched the firm. And the feedback that we got, one of the most important items, was that we came dressed in a T-shirt and jeans, me and my co-founder Russ, and they were very upset that we did not wear suit and tie for this venture firm. So needless to say, we did not get the funding, but. It was in that summer in the incubator that I was working with Russ Simmons, not the hip-hop mogul, but the software engineer that I knew from PayPal as well. And we were playing around with a bunch of wacky ideas. But one of the things floating around within the incubator was, hey, Yellow Pages is out there. Craigslist is killing the newspapers. There's another dead tree business, aka the Yellow Pages. No one's really disrupted it. There's some basic stuff on the internet. It's really minimal directory sites. Maybe there's an opportunity there. And at the same time, there was the context of consumer reviews with Amazon. City Search had done a really crappy version of consumer reviews. You had the rise of social networks. So Friendster had just taken off, Orkut, MySpace, of course. And so, we started playing around with what if you merged some of those ideas, so consumer reviews, married it with a social network, but the challenge became, well, how do you get that social network to take off? You already have Friendster, is it too late? Are they just gonna add that as a feature? But where we thought we hit it was I was at lunch with Russ and we were talking about, how do you get people to share this incredible consumer review content about local businesses? And the idea popped out with, well, if you were asked, like if I asked you, Russ, you would obviously be excited to give me an answer. And maybe we can build a service around asking friends for a recommendation. And so that was the light bulb moment that proved to not be truly a light bulb moment, but got us excited enough to start building a site. And so that was, kind of summer of 2004. And by October 2004, I had deferred business school, committed to working with Russ to see the idea through. And we launched the first version of the site centered around this concept. Lo and behold, the concept did not work as advertised. I mean, obviously the functionality was there, but people, I think they got the concept that, consumer reviews and social network and friends recommendations, all that sounds great, but it was just having this weird third-party site email out your friends and try to collect and collate these reviews just didn't make a lot of sense at the end of the day to consumers that were trying to use it. But very fortunately, buried in the site was this way to write your own review. And it was almost my fault. I almost killed the company in that I didn't think anyone would ever write a consumer review of a local business without being asked a question. And it was Russ that was, peeked over his monitor and was like, shouldn't you just be able to write a review? What if someone just wants to share something? I'm like, all right, I don't want to stifle his creativity. So I'm like, sure, go for it. Buried in there somewhere. No one's ever going to use that feature. Unfortunately, he did add it. And, when we launched, one of the things actually that I took away, going to digress for a second, took away from PayPal was the idea of the pivot. PayPal famously switched ideas 3 or 4 times, and I knew that history. And so when we did launch Yelp, in my heart of hearts, as we launched, I really tried to remind myself, as painful as it was, that we probably didn't get it perfectly right, even though we thought we were super geniuses. There was probably some way that we got it wildly wrong, and we should look for something that is working if it doesn't work. And so that, as soon as we launched, that's what I was doing, especially as the data was coming in. It was like, people don't like this site very much. But as I was querying the database, I could see, user ID, and then they'd write a review, and then they'd write another, and they'd write another. And some people would write 3 or 5 or 10 reviews in one sitting. And so that was the true light bulb moment of, maybe review writing is fun, and we didn't even know it. And so just with that one little insight, we started to reshape the site around being a platform for you to share your recommendations. And it took, another 4 months or so. I think it was February 2005. A new version of the site came up. We never shut the site down, but we just kind of built a bunch of new features and reskinned it. And as soon as we turned it on, at that moment, it was like night and day. People really got it right away, started reviewing things. People started discovering things in the city that they didn't know about. Prior to Yelp, there were lots of hidden gems everywhere, and it was really hard to find them. You had to know people. You had to know people that had been here a while. They're like, that alley over there has a really cool wine bar. But all that stuff started to become visible, and so it was like the light had turned on in San Francisco. And it took some time to really build a huge community and build a large audience. But that's kind of how the site started.
You mentioned the pivot, and I'll do this. You mentioned the pivot, and I think the story doesn't end there. Even as the company grew and scaled, you've at least I participated in some occasions where you made a dramatic change, even at scale, be it the 824 acquisition, then the resell, the aggressive shift to a mobile app. Even before, now everyone are doing this, but beforehand, Yelp was very aggressively moving to native apps, being a part of Apple. How those decisions unfolded or became, what was the thinking behind those strategic decisions and the big shifts in strategies as time went by?
I mean, I think the hardest thing for any tech leader is, with the innovation cycles moving so fast, how do you stay relevant? How do you steer the ship? How do you make sure that you don't miss a key technology cycle? And so, it did feel like we were staring down a major change when the iPhone launched in 2007. It was like, this feels different. And, there immediately soon after were rumors that there might be an app store. And as soon as the iPhone launched, actually, we were like trying to break into Apple and get a meeting with Steve Jobs or something and tell him, you should use our content. We did end up, I think, getting a meeting there, but I think they all knew that the App Store was coming, and so they're like, settle down, wait your turn. There might be something for you in the future. And so when the App Store, sort of all that developers kit and stuff came out, we were very excited to embrace it. And it did feel like one of those moments where it could be a new starting line, which is awfully frustrating because it's like you go from time equals 0, where you have nothing, to getting a site that is working and getting increasing distribution and growing city by city, and feel like, wow, I think we've created something that is valuable. And then you see this new technology cycle coming, new platform coming, you're like, oh my God, we could fumble the football right here. So it was a little bit of a harrowing feeling, like we were back at the starting line.
Was there a fierce, we should focus on our core, we shouldn't waste energy and developer time on this new thing called iOS?
Yeah. I mean, there were some individuals who I will not name that had their doubts. And the team at that point, the engineering product team, is so small that if you do chase after one of these things, that means you're not doing a whole lot else in the organization. We did, we didn't completely distract the organization, but it does take significant time and attention away. There was another example of a false technology cycle that we fortunately were able to mostly avoid, which is the original Facebook platform. If you remember, was anyone around? Like, anyone remember that the very early Facebook platform where they're like, build it all into Facebook? And literally, I think for 9 months, the entire Valley pretty much directed all of their engineering resources into building apps within Facebook, into their walled garden. And it turns out that the only things that really worked there were like Words with Friends and the Zynga games and stuff like that.
For a little bit.
But people did, until they changed the rules. But that was a scary moment, and we did test the waters. I personally was working with our VP of engineering. We didn't want to distract the team because we didn't fully believe in the platform yet, and so we prototyped some stuff on the side, and then ultimately determined this isn't going to be a game changer for us. And it was like a very fortunate bet because that felt like that was another one where it's like, is it a starting line or is it just a fad? And then we fortunately bet on fad and saved some engineering resources, but. So it's not always obvious. Sometimes these things come at you. There's a lot of hype behind them, and in fact, you'll see all of your peers chasing after it, and hopefully, you made the right bet.
Let's talk about something that I just came back from Israel from the amazing Icon conference over there, and I discovered that there's a dirty word in Hebrew called sales.
It's not dirty, it's a wonderful word.
It's a wonderful word. And I think one of the things I noticed is Israeli founders are sometimes intimidated, coming from a similar background like you, engineering, et cetera, about selling your product at scale with salespeople, especially local sales. How was that going for you?
Oh, man. Well, my product, actually, it's almost like you have to sell it to two different audiences because you got the consumer side, and especially for us in the early days, we were trying to get this whole, concept of the power user, the Yelp Elite Squad going. And so, even before sales, I hired a marketing person. And, this is like February 2005. We had just hired this marketing person. We have a handful of users that are not our friends, relatives, moms. And it's like, wow, there's strangers using this site. Like, that's cool. And the marketing guy is like, yeah, we should go meet them. I'm like, hell no, I'm an engineer by training, I'm a product person, I build the stuff, they use the stuff. But he dragged me kicking and screaming to go meet these people in person. And it was a totally eye-opening experience. And ultimately, our collaboration led to sort of what became the Yelp Elite Squad and doing these events. And I was at the center of the community for many years, which was a very unnatural place to find myself. I think that happens to you. I'm sure lots of people in this room can relate. It's like once you start this company, you got to make it work. So whatever obstacles come at you or whatever odd things you have to do, you do them. So that was one interesting example. And then sales sort of came along soon after that. And yeah, I mean, at PayPal, it was not really sales team driven at all. So I didn't even get to see it in my brief work history. I mean, PayPal obviously did have businesses involved, but they were online merchants and they kind of self-served. And the money from consumers just naturally flowed their way. And so there was not a whole lot of selling involved. But very quickly we realized, comparables were Yellow Pages and City Search, and they all had pretty big sales teams. And so the answer for us was initially, do what we do best, to build some product, create some functionality that was advertising and enhanced profiles and all that stuff. So get the portfolio of features together. And then we took one of our product managers, who was a little salesy, and he's a good talker. And we said, Bob, you're our sales guy. Start calling people and see if you can sell this product. And he's a fun guy, and he took up the torch, and he actually was able to sell a few deals. And so that gave us the early insights of like, oh, okay, maybe this could be a thing and this will work. And so we added a few more highly overqualified salespeople, which is always good, I think, in the beginning. Like it was all these individuals that you would never expect to find in sales, but are very flexible, super smart, former lawyers, just people that wanted to be involved with the startup. And so they helped us collectively figure out like, what is the pitch, who does it resonate with, what are the problems. And then once we felt like it really gelled, then it was time to scale. And so at that, that was a few months, probably like, I don't know, 6 months, 6 months had passed. And so at that point we had a COO, so kind of business scale type person that I had hired and was getting along well with. And then we went out and together hired our first VP of sales. And sales is one of those functions. I mean, there's different types, obviously. There's enterprise sales, and there's the SMB stuff that we specialize in. And then, so there's slightly different ways of going about it, slightly different profiles of salespeople. But the easy thing is you don't really typically have to reinvent the wheel. It's kind of like the CFO function, like good VPs of sales or good SVPs of sales or CROs know the template. And so if you hire someone who's selling a product at a similar price point with similar churn characteristics, all the same stuff, they'll have a good framework to get you started. And then you'll tune, and there will be nuances to your particular business. But as a result, it wasn't as scary as it looked. I think, the piece that does become scary, especially in the SMB world, is the number of humans that you need to employ to reach the millions of business owners that are out there. And so that has implications on how does it change your culture, and suddenly you go from a little R&D team to you have 10 engineers, but then you have 45 salespeople. And so how does the company feel? And that was actually one thing, there was one piece of advice that I got from Jeremy Levine that was particularly prescient, which was we were about to, I think we had in our plan that we presented at our board meeting to him, hey, we're going to go hire 60 people. Maybe we're at like 15 or 20 or something like that. And he's like, that's really going to be a challenge, particularly culturally. It's going to, change everything, and you really have to feel like, your systems are dialed, your training is dialed to get to that kind of scale. And so we ratcheted it back to something like 35 people, and that, as soon as we had those 35 people, it was like, oh man, like he was right. Like I'm so glad that we do not have 60 heads right now that we're trying to corral. So, it does become a challenge operationally and scale-wise, but the actual template of how do you do it, it's not that bad. And there is a common mistake. I probably fell for it early on too, but I see, in talking to the startup community, you see it a lot where there's this bias against bringing on sales at all. And I'd say it is extremely rare to not need salespeople. There's common myths like, oh, Google doesn't need salespeople. They just, it's all self-serve. It's like, they have thousands of salespeople. They have all these enterprise-y people, like selling national advertisers. They have all these, they have people sitting there that wait for you to come in the door, so the AdWords coordinators. But then they call you and they say, oh, we see you signed up. Your campaign's all screwed up. Let us help you spend $10,000 a day. Thank you very much.
Precious souls. Let's talk about, you mentioned something about culture and change and growth. How did you find yourself from being an engineer to where you are today, where I think 4,000 salespeople or something like that. How did it shape your own traits and the way you operate as a manager or as a leader, well, as the organization grow and the challenges grow?
I would say I was very lucky in the sense that Yelp was always a strong grower, but it was never like growth insanity. Growth insanity, you could look back on some examples like maybe Uber or like a Zenefits maybe, or Groupon. Some of these companies, they catch on, and the growth demands are so hot that it's really hard to, sort of methodically develop the culture, establish the values, grow from within, which is kind of a key component of the Yelp culture. We kind of, for many years, we're growing by like about 100% every year for several years, I'd say, and then it slowed down to maybe 50%, and now it's been in the 20s. And that kind of growth does allow you to have a nice, grow from within, develop your people, culture. And ultimately, I think it's defined by, who you hire, who you fire, who you promote, sets the tone. We were very early, I think it was probably 2007, maybe even before that, 2006, 2007, we set the Yelp values in stone, established the purpose. Because in the very beginning, everybody learns through osmosis. You all know each other so well. Everyone kind of gets a sense of what are the expectations. But once you're at 50 plus people, not everybody gets it. Not everybody knows the subtleties. And so the more explicit you could be about what are the rules of the road, what are the guide rails, what are the things we care about, who are the constituencies that we should watch out for. Those are all really important to be explicit about. And so that's something that we've spent some time on.
Awesome. I want to change the topic to something close to your heart. In current headlines in the last few days, we're talking a lot about the Russian meddling and the US election, and all of a sudden the discussion about consolidation of power and tech is becoming a discussion. And I think you've been a preacher around this topic for many years, even before I joined Yelp. Everyone who follows you on Twitter, that's the main topic.
There's two topics. I have two topics on
Yeah. So let's start with the first one. Consolidation of power in tech companies, especially the big ones. Why are you so worried about it, and why should we?
Man, where do I begin? Our interest in Google, goes back to the very beginning. They were a key distribution source for us. We wouldn't exist without Google. So as we got some of our early users to contribute content, that got indexed by Google's crawlers, and that started generating traffic, and it created a positive feedback loop. So the more content that we would have, the more users we'd get, which would generate even more content, and the site took off. And we really believed all of the things that Google would say in the early days. Hey, just have the highest quality content possible. We just want to be a turnstile and send users to the very best place on the internet. And so we just tried to mold ourselves into the whitest hat possible player of like, we're just going to go all in on that and deliver value, and Google's going to stay true to its values, and it's all going to be good. And over time, we just saw that slip away, just bit by bit, death by 1,000 cuts. And it was painful. I mean, it's still painful to see sort of how they've given away all of their values. I mean, I'd say an important moment was when they scraped all of our content using their sort of main Google crawl. And then they started displaying it within a brand new application that popped up in everybody's Android phone, which was the Google Places app at the time, which was a clone of Yelp. So they took our content, forced us to compete with it, gave us no attribution in that particular app. And so it was just dirty stuff, again and again. And whenever we'd point it out, it would be a glitch. It's always a glitch. And we quickly, they actually trained us into realizing, okay, the only way to push back against Google and get them to do the right thing, or at least back down from doing the evil thing, is to shame them in the press. And so that's how it all started, is they do something crazy like steal our content, and then we, talk to TechCrunch, they'd be like, what? Google did that? No, they're such a wonderful company. They're not evil. They would never. And we're like, take a look. And they're like, oh my God, this has got to go out immediately. And so, stories would come out, And then they would back off some of the time. That did work for a while. And then eventually, I think, they tried to buy us. That didn't work out. And then I think they just decided to stop playing that game. They're like, all right, we're just going to, we're not going to listen to Yelp anymore. We're not going to allow ourselves to be shamed. We're just going to crawl their content. We're going to put it into, now it was, the Google local competitive application, and we're not going to remove it. We're just not going to take it out of there. If they want it out, and they told us this, they're like, you can de-index yourself, just take yourself out of Google entirely, which is obviously like kill the company. So, so at that point, we weren't left with a whole lot to do other than turn to the government and say, hey, this is interesting, has a lot of parallels to, Microsoft versus Netscape. So our VP of Government Relations happened to be at this Attorneys General's conference. Google, I don't think Google's lawyers had really been paying attention to the whole controversy, and he presented it. It was an incredible presentation, delivered it flawlessly, and became the buzz of this conference. And that guy, and Google's lawyers, of course, were there, also attending the conference. And, that ended a week later. Google, sent an email, we've had a change of heart about this whole, like, stealing your content, putting in the competitor thing, like, we're going to stop doing that. And so that kind of, it's just been this back and forth of them doing something like that, us having to, speak to regulators or what have you, and trying to push back. So that's the Yelp issue. That probably doesn't apply, that doesn't necessarily help illustrate why does this apply to everybody else. But it's just a microcosm. I mean, there's obviously, that's one vertical. There's lots of other verticals that have been affected, whether it's shopping, whether it's hotels, flights, the list goes on. But then it's also competitive, like it's innovators as well. Because I'm the anti-Google guy, I tend to get entrepreneurs coming to me saying, hey, I have a problem. And unfortunately, it's always this like, shh, don't tell anyone. I don't want anyone to know. But they do, they're out there. There's probably a few of you in this room. I don't recognize any faces, I promise I won't identify you. But they have stories, like, hey, we built this thing. It's really great. Market's been taking off. Google suddenly came into the market, and they're undercutting all the pricing, and so it's hurting my business. I don't think it's viable now. What should I do? I'm like, come with me to Washington. And they're like, oh, you can't do that. And so you take examples like that and just repeat it again and again. And what do you have? You have stifling of innovation. There's also, back to where you started.
Google was doing this right now.
Huh? Yeah.
Google.
Stop it, Google. If you have just a couple entities that control the world's information, that's terrifying. So you think about, someone that's interested, and there's a real example, and they're like, did the Holocaust happen? And when you get the answer, from a Holocaust denier website, you're like, fuck this. What is going on here? And the reality is the world gets their information from Google, even if you don't want to. They love to say, this is my favorite saying, competition is a click away. That's such bullshit. And the reason why is because they pay billions of dollars to be the default. Billions of dollars. When you type in a search to Safari, you don't get anything but Google. Why is that? If Google's so amazing and you would just do it for free, Google shouldn't pay a dime for that. But they do, because they know that the default matters. It matters a lot. It mattered in the Microsoft case as well. If you had IE there, you probably don't download Netscape, right? And so that is infuriating when they say that. And also, if you think, I think a lot of people in here, product and engineering people, and you think, the competition is a click away is sort of, it goes back to rational economic theory of people will do what's best in their best interests. They just will, they're rational. We all know that's bullshit. They do what is the default, right? Behavioral economics, behavioral psychology. So they're playing a funny game there. And then, of course, you can flip over to the Facebook side, and I think that's particularly frustrating as well. Obviously, there's a lot of privacy implications, all that data in one place. And then I don't feel like there's been a lot of candor and okay, we see what's going on here. This is embarrassing, and let us open the doors and show everything that we've got and have candid, straightforward conversations. I don't think that's happening, and I find that pretty upsetting.
Let's talk about the second first world problem, which is housing in Silicon Valley.
My other issue. 2 issues on Twitter.
That's the second issue I see.
Follow me and you get a lot of Google and a lot of housing.
Yeah, we have a lot of people either owning a house and happy with the constant living cost increase, or people renting that are looking forward to hear what you have to say.
Yeah. I mean, there's been an area of passion of mine for, I guess, about 3.5 years or so. It became obvious that the way that the Bay Areas and really all of California handles housing policy is totally broken. You may or may not know that, particularly here in San Francisco, there's a lot of land, 7 by 7, 7 miles by 7 miles. But if you shoot a drone up, or when you're flying over, you'll see it's all these little single-family homes and the occasional apartment building. And it is actually illegal in most of the city to build one of those apartment buildings. Mid-rise, we're not talking towers, but even mid-rise apartment buildings anymore. Totally impossible. And that's crazy. We have these 40-foot height limits that were installed in the 70s when they felt like the city was going crazy. It was turning into Manhattan or what have you. But I think, if we allow the status quo to continue, we will kill the golden goose that is Silicon Valley and San Francisco. If you think about, why all of you employ, I'm sure, lots of various folks, especially technical, but the cost of compensation continues to escalate. Where do you think that money goes? Does it go into their savings and they're buying yachts and so forth? No, most of it ends up going straight into the pockets of the people that own the buildings, own the homes. Rents continue to escalate, and so I feel like I'm surprised actually that more people aren't on the oh my God, we have to solve this housing thing train. And it's not unique just to California. It's showing up anywhere there's an economic center, and anywhere there is a lot of economic activity, there's going to be more people coming in than going out, which brings up demand, and you've got to address that with supply. And so you have to get serious about supply, and that's basically what I've been excited about is finding and backing activists that they typically go by the moniker YIMBY, yes in my backyard. And it does end up feeling a little bit like a generational divide. The people that moved here in the 70s, 80s, maybe early 90s, they're loving it. This is the greatest thing ever. I got my retirement fund, my house. When I get out of here, I'm going to be rich. So status quo is really working for most of those folks. But if you're 22 and you're trying to work for one of the companies in this room, it's brutal. And so that also limits the diversity. Think about, I remember graduating, and I didn't even consider New York because cost of living in New York was so high. I'm like, oh, I can't go there. So what do you end up with? You end up with very wealthy, very privileged people get to have some of these best economic opportunities. And so I don't think that's fair. I think we should make room for more people, and so therefore we should all be trying to get more housing built at all levels.
Cool. I have one last question about the future of Yelp. How do you see the next 10 to 14 years in Silicon Valley in general, or for Yelp? But beforehand, I'm going to save, and we're going to make room for more questions, but I'm going to kill, I think, half of the hands over here by asking, why isn't Yelp in Israel? And when is it coming, right? That's half of the question. When? Yeah, easy is the easy one.
Yeah, there's already a site there, so problem solved. Why is Yelp not in Israel? We did we spent some time on an international expansion. We launched in lots of major markets. Google, became increasingly aggressive in pushing content down the page, particularly in the local vertical, and so that stifled our growth. And so our growth rate wasn't such that we felt like, hey, this is ever going to be a real business for us. So we put the brakes on that about 1.5 years ago. And so we didn't get to Israel. It was on my list. I've been there before. It's a great place. Tel Aviv, amazing. But also some of the difficulties with the right-left and formatting things proved to be expensive, and so it wasn't top of our list as far as markets to chase after. You have a startup? Perfect. All right. Well, when we get going again, I'll let you know. So that's the Israel story, and then where does Yelp go from here? I think we obviously went from basically a desktop web company to a mobile app company, which is kind of crazy to think about because, when we first started in 2008, it was just this little R&D experiment. Now our whole company is basically on mobile. And then I think from here, it becomes how can we build in more engagement into the app, and particularly that ties into transactions, so more transactional capabilities. You touched on we bought E24. We started getting in the delivery business. It changed really rapidly on us, and we were going to have to build a delivery network, which we were not excited about. Unfortunately, Grubhub came in and said, hey, let's just solve this together. And so we have an incredible partnership that we just launched with Grubhub. We have like 80,000 restaurants now on the platform. So if you haven't checked out the food ordering experience on Yelp, it was just massively upgraded. So pretty excited about that. And then we have some other cool smaller companies that we've been building out within Yelp. Yelp Reservations, which competes with OpenTable. No8, which is like miraculous experience. Basically, for the restaurants that we have on there, and there's a bunch in San Francisco now, it's typically like the busiest, most insane line places, and you can add yourself to the wait list from the comfort of your couch. So I'd encourage you to check that out. And then Yelp Wi-Fi, which is really about retention marketing for SMBs. So you come into the cafe, you can get on their Wi-Fi, but then they also get the right to send you offers and bring you back into the store.
Cool. Questions?
I'm wondering if there's a new starting line now with admin chat and posts and that level of community interaction with messaging, what that's becoming.
Yeah, sure. So the question was, does chat and voice represent kind of a new starting line? It's an interesting question. It does feel like, for the most part, it's a component of the mobile platforms. And so, it's a race of the big companies, the Amazons and the Apples and the Googles through Android. And so that's mostly how we've been playing it. We're monitoring that closely, but the good news, at least for us so far, is with the exception of Google, everyone for local data is using our data. So, if you go on Alexa and ask it about local businesses, you're hearing from Yelp. So it's a little early to call it, but so far it doesn't feel like a huge shift for us. I'll repeat it.
Did you ever think of going back to your initial premise of actually making people ask? So now that you have a critical mass.
Yeah. So we're going to go back to asking friends for recommendations.
I feel I have homework tonight. Thank you.
We do have some experiments in like conversational message board. Like we do have a message board on Yelp called Talk. It's a little bit too far-flung, too many people trying to talk to one another. We have some ideas that we've been toying around with. It's a little too early to know if some of those concepts will come back. It is funny enough, like it's the first thing that people often suggest when they're thinking about how do you solve this, like what's a great local business question? And then, so it's where I started as well. But what you do realize is for a lot of different things, your immediate social network doesn't have that much to offer. You might get a recommendation, but it's like one point in time, one experience. And so that's useful as a pointer to, oh, they mentioned this business. But then you still want to say, okay, but how does the business perform 100 times over? Like, what does the whole community have to say? So I think the ideal solution is, a combination of that person-to-person word of mouth matched with the voice of the community.
How big is the problem with fake reviews and people gaming the system and doing a lot right to people actually mastery and on the right program, or is it still
Yeah, so how do we deal with, oh dear. How do we deal with the fake reviews problem? And have we mastered it? I think it's one of these things that you will never master. If you say you've mastered it, you probably are failing miserably because you're not sufficiently humble about the challenge. It is something that we realized was going to be a problem within 2 weeks of launching the site. Part of it, I blame City Search because they really trained business owners to solicit reviews and fake reviews on their own behalf because they didn't really take the consumer review thing very seriously. And so in response to that, our initial take was, okay, we'll build what we originally called the review filter and now called the recommendation engine. And essentially what it does is try to figure out which reviews are the most reliable and we can establish the most trust in, and then show those. And then the ones where we're like suspicious for some reason or there's some data pattern that suggests that there's something going on, we take those off the page. Over time, there was push for transparency around which ones are we taking off the page, which ones are we putting on the page. So now we have a whole section that you can view for any business page if you go down to the bottom, it'll say 23 reviews not recommended. And so you tap on that, and you can see all the reviews that we're not currently recommending. But we're always learning about those individual reviewers, and so if our calculus changes, that content can come back onto the page. So we've been a pioneer, with that technology. Google eventually, after several years, finally adopted kind of a similar thing. I don't think they have the same transparency that we do. The sophistication level continues to rise on the, as it's more valuable to game Yelp, we see more serious efforts to try and game Yelp, but also our investment level and our sophistication in our own technology continues to rise too. So it's this cat and mouse game that I think we'll never get away from. There's also a whole industry that's cropped up that's essentially review solicitors. So they go and they say, hey, we're going to boost your rating on whatever site, and we're going to email either your favorite customers or the ones that already say you're positive or what have you. There's a whole sketchy industry forming in this area, and so we've essentially declared war on that. And so we, if you are doing heavy solicitation and it's apparent to us, then we'll put up consumer alerts warning consumers that stuff's going on. And penalize your search. A lot of these techniques are taken essentially from the search world. So Google's done a bunch of this for its web search, where if you're a bad actor, you do something black hat, they'll drop you in the rankings or ban you from the index. And so we're starting to build out that tool set as well. I don't think so. I mean, antitrust has been around for a long time. And it's like Google in the beginning, it's fine that Google exists, and they're providing a new ecosystem for lots of new companies to thrive. Same thing, on mobile platforms, like the development of the mobile platform meant there was lots of room for innovation. So that's a good thing. But when a company becomes truly massive, dominates the market, it can start compromising consumers. It can start choking off distribution. And ultimately, that becomes, I think, a real problem for innovation. Go back to the Microsoft example, which I think a lot of people forget about. Microsoft, great platform, very successful. It's their operating system. Why should they allow Netscape to exist in it? And sure enough, they started choking off Netscape. In fact, going into the code, it's documented, and slowing it down specifically. Pretty bad behavior, I would say. They started also changing the landscape of the web, which is now something that Google's been trying to do with AMP, as it turns out. But they were building out ActiveX controls, trying to make the web proprietary. And so in that world, where Google controls or Microsoft controls the operating system, they control the browser, what would happen if in 1998 Microsoft realized, this Google thing is crap. We can't allow this to succeed. We should make sure that it doesn't get distribution. They could have done that. And so that's the type of thing that I think regulators need to watch out for and be vigilant. And the other piece too is just when you have consolidation, there's weird effects that are hard to predict. And so I think we're seeing that with the privacy stuff coming out of Facebook, the election stuff, the Russian hacking. You only have two companies that the Russians really had to manipulate: Google and Facebook. Google, both you could manipulate the web search results, but then everyone forgets about YouTube. YouTube is like a radicalization engine. You watch one weird video, or you even watch a normal video, then it shows you a weird video, an even weirder video, and before long, your brain is all potentially mixed up. So yeah, my take is there's nothing wrong with a successful business, and in fact, most new startups are born out of the ecosystem created by a previous larger company. That's fine. But you should be under, greater scrutiny. You should try to play fair. You should try to have a level playing field. I would argue in a lot of ways Apple has done that, particularly in our category in local. Yelp is not the only provider of content for Apple Maps. They actually do a pretty reasonable job of trying to figure out, oh, well, you know what, for hotels, TripAdvisor kicks our ass. So they're going to show TripAdvisor. That's a pretty fair and reasonable thing to do. So, I don't think all big companies necessarily are the same or, should be given a heavy hand. The beginning of Yelp Elite and the keys for success of that community effort. It was very organic, is I guess how I describe it. We did that first meetup with just a handful, I think it was 2 Yelp users that my marketing person suggested. And the surprising thing right away was, number one, even though we were a tech company and I expected the early adopters at that time would definitely be men, it was 2 women. So it was like, oh, that's interesting. And then also they weren't necessarily passionate about technology as much as they were passionate about finding what's new and cool in the city. And so I was like, oh, that's also quite interesting. They were urban early adopters as opposed to maybe tech early adopters. And they were also extremely social and wonderful people to have a drink with and have a conversation with. And so that got us thinking, well, maybe what would happen, this organic idea, what would happen if we got a bunch of these early users together? And so that was the next step. It was like, okay, let's get, instead of 2 of them together, let's get 100. Can we get 100 together? And so we rented out a venue and put together an event, which got made fun of, I think, in the tech press at the time, of like, oh, we're back to the dot-com boom time. This stupid startup is throwing crazy parties for its Yelp Elites. But we brought together 100 people and called it a Yelp Elite, and we had named it by then, Yelp Elite Launch Party. And it was an incredible energy, incredible vibe. It felt right. Like people were really excited to meet one another. They were all early users of the site. And a lot of people actually brought a +1. And so we noticed that, and we saw some of these people showing up on the site afterwards. And so again, it was sort of an organic observation. Oh, this could actually be a way to grow the nascent community. And so because it worked, we didn't know that it would be something we'd do forever. We're still doing it today. We throw events in, probably 80 different cities across the country and Canada. So we didn't know that we would be doing it forever, but it kept, growing the contributor base and what, the content that these folks were providing was incredible. It was very high quality, very creative. And so we thought it set the standard of what we wanted on the site anyways. And so that was the beginning. The hardest challenge, I would say, once we sort of had the original insight of this is how we're going to build the community, was how do you replicate it? How do you get it going in Chicago? How do you get it going in Boston? And what does this person, the community manager, really do? And so developing that playbook and understanding the type of person that might be a fit for that role and might not be a fit. And the interesting thing is there was no one right answer. We've had a lot of different types of successful community managers. I think an authentic desire to contribute themselves to the site and passion for the site was one thing. But then it's just, a people person, someone that loves just intrinsically pulling people together. The more that, they were all already one of these connector types that had very big personal social networks was a good indicator that they'd be an outlier community manager.
Quick question. Talk about testing.
Sure.
So I'm sure you keep experimenting now that you're looking forward to what's next and which areas of design. I'd love to hear a little bit about how you separate from the artistic product or everybody does everything, which is more of the practical things that is looking management is only looking forward. So how do you
Yeah. I would say, Effi, you're probably as much an expert on this as I am. There's no innovation group. There's no Yelp X. As much as I would love to have monopoly profits to fund whimsical scientific endeavors, it's much more organic. It comes from all levels. One of the ways I like to describe how you should be investing, in an R&D within your company is you kind of want the Warren Buffett projects and the Ron Conway projects. And the Warren Buffett should be 80%. It's your safe stuff, your incremental investment, you know what you're going to get likely out of it, you got to do it. And so you just try to execute really well on that core stuff. And that provides your sort of basic growth and keeps your product alive and happy. And then there's your 20% of insanity, risky things, stuff where you're not sure. And that sort of ties back to the Ron Conway idea of he makes a lot of smaller investments, 25K bet, 50K bet, 100K bet. And so similarly, we're striving to have a portfolio of these crazier ideas, these riskier projects, and that's where the innovation comes from. The other piece too is as a company of our size, you have to start thinking about the portfolio of products. Like historically, for many, many years, I only thought about just the core Yelp, reviewing, the audience, the sales effort, that's it. And then at some point, you have to kind of pull back and say, okay, that is a great business, that's the core. Can I bolt on a couple more things that contribute back to the core and maybe become extra legs of the stool? And I'd say a bunch of the great companies have been able to build extra legs of the stool. Classic case would be Amazon's done an incredible job of that. Salesforce has sort of had this, the Salesforce software at its core, and then bolted on other products as well, pretty successfully. Oracle's probably another. There's a million examples of these that the really big, long-lasting companies demonstrate some muscle or have built some muscle in this area, and so that's relatively new. And frankly, if you go back and say in CEO school, what did they not tell you? Because I didn't go to CEO school, and probably no one here. I don't think there is such thing as CEO school. Is there does come a time where you have to think about your company more like a portfolio approach, and like what are the things to buy, and no one really tells you when the right time to transition your thinking is. It's probably after you're public at some point. Some companies have a very long runway where their core business just grows like crazy for a decade or so. Others, maybe it gets into the 30s or 20s, and you're like, okay, where am I going to get more growth sooner? And so for us, we're kind of in that middle zone of like, okay, we're at 20 to 30%. What are the things we can plant seeds now on that will continue to help us grow fast into the future? At its simplest level, it's build more housing and build dense housing, and ideally dense housing near transit. So much of it is completely self-inflicted. I talked a little bit about height limits, zoning, all that stuff is very wrong-headed. Was set up in the 70s, with good intentions, I'm sure, but is totally messed up. Getting involved politically, the YIMBY group, there's an SF YIMBY group, there's a CA YIMBY group. There's also an incredible state senator. Does everyone know their state senators? No, nobody does. But there's one you should know, because he's a genius, Scott Wiener, and he's got actually a bill that he's trying to get through this year, SB 827, with the idea of raising height limits near transit corridors. So you think there's actually places that have BART stops that are surrounded only by single-family homes, and it's illegal to build an apartment building like at the BART stop. Berkeley's been in constant battles over this kind of stuff. I think they just approved some building near their BART stop. But so a lot of it is just completely self-inflicted. There's another really big problem, which is Prop 13. It creates very perverse incentives. And so what basically municipalities, cities like Cupertino or whatever, when they're thinking about their own problems, which is typically like probably paying workers' pensions or what have you, they're like, we need more money because we got to pay these pensions. How do we generate revenue? Well, it turns out that building office space generates a lot more revenue. It's more profitable for them than building housing. So what do you think always gets built? Lots of office space. And so, you have situations like new Facebook campus, and Facebook, is now trying to get involved in sort of the housing. It's become such a big issue. Companies are finally engaging on it, but Apple with a ginormous headquarters and 13,000 or so seats in that building, and where's the housing? There is no housing attached to that. It's not their fault. The city should obviously do it, but their incentives are perverse, so you can't blame them either. I think we just have to sort of understand the problem. There is a diagnosis. There's actually a cure, but we have to get the political will to apply the cure. Yeah.
How much do you think that you now, as CEO of Yelp, need to be paramount, or is it a bunch of investment?
how paranoid do I need to be about Google? I mean, hopefully everyone that runs a tech company is a little paranoid about Google, because every business with margins, especially big margins, is probably interesting to them. I think they still play a role in our business. I think we've been very conscious of their shadow and trying to create as much independence and control over our destiny. I think we've gotten better. I think Apple's rise and distribution through Apple Maps has improved the situation somewhat. I think also just the fact that apps are a thing helps. In some ways it hurts because obviously on Android, Google's in this sort of Microsoft position. But to the extent we can convince users that Yelp is better or provide something different, differentiated, we now have a direct relationship versus the starting point is simply a search. But Google is working hard to change that. You look at AMP and their effort there to make the web faster, but then also under Google's thumb. That doesn't bode well for the app ecosystem. And there's been lots of subtle ways that Google's tried to erode the app ecosystem, I would argue. They went after interstitials, where it was like, well, if you land on the site and you pitch someone on downloading your app, like that's bad, and you shouldn't do that, and Google will penalize you if you do that. They decided to come up with this rule. Originally specifically directed at Yelp, actually, and then we forced them, because of our pushback, to broaden it to a bigger campaign against interstitials and ads. But I'm digressing, but I just would leave you with the point that they still actually use interstitials to promote their own stuff. Like if you use Gmail enough on the web, they're like, hey, here's an interstitial, download the app. So there's lots of subtle ways that they're trying to make sure that they maintain their monopoly. Do bad things.
A lot of founders in the room, and is there any advice you give founders that are early on, something like something very practical, like a term sheet, or something you could go back in time and tell yourself would have saved you time and money and headache?
Let's see, startup advice. How many people are like A round? I just need to gauge the audience. B round? C round? D round? Okay, it's kind of all over the map. Let's see. I would say making sure that you have a great operational partner. Like one of the things that I lucked into pretty early on was, I mentioned him a little bit earlier, was a COO. So, especially coming from a technical background, like none of us, probably someone in this room can do every single role within the company and do it incredibly. I can't. I have sort of strengths and weaknesses. And so the number one thing you can do, especially as the leader, is to try to maintain that humility, understand where you have weaknesses and augment like crazy. So for me, it was someone that had seen scale and could build, sort of help us build out the big sales team, the big marketing and community management effort. And I lucked into a person that, was able to have partnership with me at Yelp for a decade. And that worked great and got me to a place where I was able to build up some capabilities and take on even more responsibilities at Yelp, which I'd say I do now, but even still, there's holes in what I'm good at, and so I very consciously try to make sure we have great people in those roles that love doing that thing, because I guess that's the other piece is if you don't love doing it, you're going to do such a half-assed job. So if you find yourself consistently, no matter how much you work at it, like I hate doing this, try to find someone that's really incredible at it, because it's probably important, and that way it'll actually get done. Another question.
So Effi is
Yes, ma'am.
part of our community, and I'm sure you know him well. Can you share something embarrassing about him?
I will share also something.
He has twins. Embarrassing. No, not that one. I don't know. He's a straight shooter for the most part. I'd say there is something to Israeli culture. It's like, strong-willed. Often has very forceful opinions. But the good news is he's pretty smart, and so we don't butt heads too much. And usually when he argues like hell for some idea, it was the right idea. So it all works out. His podcast? I didn't know you had.
You should not listen to this podcast.
Hopefully it's PG.
Nope.
Oh no. You just got him fired.
Yeah, but I got fired.
It was nice knowing you, Effie.
It was a pleasure working with you. Thank you.
That's it?
Mo, done? Good?
All right.
Cool. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Jeremy.
Sure thing.